As the man handed over his license and registration, Officer Harris leaned in closer, scrutinizing his every movement. "Where are you headed?" he asked, his tone still firm, with an edge of suspicion. The man, still calm and composed, answered, "I'm on my way to a meeting with the governor's office." The officers exchanged a glance, their skepticism growing. Officer Thompson, now circling the car with his flashlight, eyed the man up and down, sizing him up. He couldn't help but notice the expensive suit, the polished shoes, and the air of quiet confidence surrounding him. "Funny," Officer Harris remarked, his voice dripping with disbelief, "you don't look like someone who'd be meeting with the governor. More like a guy trying to avoid the speed limit." The man raised an eyebrow at the insinuation but said nothing. He could feel the judgment in the officer's eyes, their assumptions based solely on his appearance. They saw a black man dressed in fine clothes, and to them, he didn't belong in such a powerful position. He could feel the weight of their prejudices in the air, and it made the situation increasingly uncomfortable. Despite their lingering doubts, the officers continued with their questioning. Officer Thompson walked back to his patrol car, presumably to run a check on the man's information, still unsure of what he was dealing with. Meanwhile, Officer Harris kept his eyes locked on the man, his expression hardening as he thought about his next move. For a few moments, the man simply sat in the driver's seat, waiting. He was no stranger to this kind of treatment, he had grown accustomed to being underestimated and doubted. But today, there was more at stake than just his personal pride. He wasn't just any man driving through the streets. The realization hit him, today was about to be a lesson for these officers. A lesson they would never forget. And so, with a quiet resolve, he began to prepare himself for the revelation that would shift everything. Little did the officers know, the man they were questioning wasn't just anyone. He was about to show them a side of themselves they didn't want to see. Officer Harris stood at the front of the car, his arms crossed, watching the man carefully as Officer Thompson returned to the patrol vehicle. The two officers exchanged a few quiet words, a mix of disbelief and suspicion in their voices. Officer Thompson shook his head, still unconvinced by the man's calm demeanor. "I don't know," Officer Thompson muttered, "he's too composed for someone who's just been pulled over. Doesn't add up." Officer Harris leaned in a little closer, lowering his voice so the man wouldn't hear. "Yeah, and the way he talks. It's almost like he's trying to impress us. I mean, look at him. What does a guy like that have to do with the governor?" The man, hearing their conversation but keeping his composure, knew exactly what they were thinking. He had been stopped and treated like a criminal simply because of his appearance. The officers had already made their assumptions about him based on the color of his skin and his attire. He couldn't help but feel a surge of frustration, but he controlled it, keeping his voice steady as he addressed Officer Harris. "Is there a reason why you're speaking to me like that? I've already told you where I'm going." Harris ignored the question, instead gesturing to the man's car with a dismissive flick of his hand. "Nice car," he said sarcastically, "but it's not gonna help you get out of this one. I've seen plenty of people who try to flaunt their way out of trouble, but you're not getting off that easy." The man didn't flinch, though his patience was wearing thin. He was used to these kinds of comments, the subtle digs that hinted at something deeper. They didn't see him as someone worthy of respect. Instead, he was just another black man in their eyes, and they were ready to make sure he understood his place. Officer Thompson returned to the car with a frown, holding up the man's ID. "Everything checks out," he said, but there was a hesitation in his voice. He didn't fully trust it. "You're still getting a ticket," Officer Harris insisted, his voice firm. "Even if you're not lying, it's obvious you were speeding." The man, finally feeling the weight of the situation, took a deep breath. He was ready to end this game of assumption, of judgment based purely on surface-level perceptions. "You don't seem to understand," he said, his voice low but firm, "but I'm not just any man you've stopped today." The officers exchanged a quick look, unsure of what to make of his words. "What's that supposed to mean?" Officer Thompson asked, his tone growing more hostile. The man didn't answer right away. Instead, he reached inside his jacket and slowly pulled out a badge. The moment the officers saw it, they froze. "I'm the new state police chief," the man said quietly, holding the badge up so both officers could see it. The realization hit the officers like a thunderbolt. They had no idea they had just pulled over the very person who was about to oversee their actions. The man they had assumed was just another black man in an expensive suit was, in fact, the highest-ranking officer in the state. But it was too late to take back their words and actions. The damage had already been done. The assumptions, the unfair treatment, the ridicule, it all hung in the air like a cloud, and the officers could feel its weight. The man they had mocked wasn't just anyone. He was someone they should have respected, but they hadn't. And now, they would have to face the consequences of their ignorance. The air between the officers and the man grew tense as they processed the revelation. Officer Harris stared at the badge, his eyes wide with disbelief, his voice barely a whisper. "You're the state police chief?" The man nodded slowly, his expression unwavering. The shock was evident in the officers' faces, but they didn't know what to say. The reality of the situation was sinking in. The man they had so quickly judged, the man they had mocked and treated with suspicion, was no ordinary civilian. "Yes, I am," the man replied, his voice steady, though there was a clear edge to it now. "And it seems that the very officers tasked with upholding the law have some things to learn about respect." Officer Thompson cleared his throat awkwardly, his hands now nervously fumbling with the paperwork in his hand. He was caught off guard, and his pride was beginning to crumble. We didn't know," he stammered. "We were just doing our job, making sure everything was in order. We didn't realize." The man raised a hand, signaling him to stop. "I understand you were doing your job, but let me be clear, your job isn't to assume things about people based on their skin color or their appearance. Your job is to serve and protect, to treat everyone with fairness and dignity." The officers stood silent, unable to argue with the truth of his words. For the first time, they were no longer in control of the situation. The man wasn't just a figure of authority, he was the embodiment of the power they had sworn to uphold, and they had just disrespected him. "I've spent years working hard to get to this position," the man continued, his voice calm but filled with a quiet intensity. "I've fought for equality, for justice, and for fair treatment, not just for myself, but for everyone. And today, I see exactly why we need change." Officer Harris, still trying to process what was happening, spoke up, but his words lacked conviction. "Sir, we didn't mean to disrespect you. He trailed off, realizing how empty his excuse sounded. The man cut him off again, his patience beginning to thin. "It doesn't matter what you meant. What matters is how you treated me. What matters is that you made assumptions about me, solely based on how I looked, and that was wrong." There was a long silence before Officer Thompson finally spoke, his voice lower now. "We're sorry, sir. We didn't know who you were. We were wrong, and we'll take responsibility for that." The man nodded, but the apology didn't quite suit the sting. He wasn't looking for an apology, he was looking for understanding. He wasn't here to play the role of a victim, but he also knew this moment could serve as a powerful teaching opportunity. "Apologies are only the first step," the man said, his gaze piercing. "What matters now is how you change your approach moving forward. I want both of you to remember this moment every time you stop someone in the future. I want you to remember that your assumptions could cost you more than just a fine or a ticket. It could cost you respect, trust, and credibility." The officers nodded, their expressions heavy with regret. They had crossed a line, and now they would have to face the consequences. This encounter, this man they had mistreated, was going to be a lesson they would carry with them forever. The realization that they had underestimated him, based on something as superficial as his appearance, left them unsettled. But for the man, this moment was just the beginning. He wasn't going to let this slip by without making sure the officers, and the department, understood the depth of their mistake. He wasn't here to make enemies, but he was certainly here to demand change. The man stood still, watching the officers process the information. Officer Thompson, his hands now shaking slightly, took a step back and looked at his fellow officer. The tension in the air was palpable, as the reality of their mistake set in. The man who had been pulled over was the new state police chief, the very person responsible for enforcing the laws they swore to uphold. He could feel the shift in their demeanor, the shift from arrogance to discomfort. It wasn't just that they had made an error, it was that their error had exposed their own biases, their own assumptions about who belonged in positions of power, and who didn't. For a moment, neither officer knew how to proceed. They had been so confident in their judgment, so certain that they were in control. But now, they were no longer the authority in this situation. "I've been a part of law enforcement for years," the man said, his voice cutting through the silence. "I didn't get here by pretending to be someone I'm not. And I didn't get here by letting people like you treat me like a criminal because of the way I look." The officer stood frozen, unable to look him in the eye. They had never considered the broader implications of their behavior before. In their world, they were the ones who enforced the rules, they didn't think they needed to follow them, not when it came to matters of race. But now, they were confronted with the truth: this man, in his sharp suit, was not someone to be dismissed. He was their boss, their superior, and they had just humiliated him. The man let the silence linger, before continuing. "I'm here to remind you that the badge you wear means more than just the authority to pull people over, issue tickets, and make arrests. It means you are responsible for the lives you touch, and that includes the lives of the people you don't understand or even like." He took a slow, deliberate step closer to the officers, his presence now impossible to ignore. "What you don't know, Officer Thompson, is that I spent years working in the trenches, doing everything I could to prove myself. And what you don't know, Officer Harris, is that I've had to deal with this kind of treatment every day of my life. Being judged by my skin, being underestimated because of it. But I'm not the exception, am I?" The officers looked down, their guilt mounting. They could feel their world shifting, the weight of their assumptions about race, power, and privilege pressing down on them. They had never considered how deeply ingrained their biases were, how they were willing to judge someone based on their outward appearance alone. The man's voice softened slightly. "The reason I'm telling you all this isn't to humiliate you. It's to help you understand that the work we do goes beyond following procedures and carrying out arrests. It's about ensuring that we treat everyone fairly, regardless of their background. That means you need to examine the way you see people, the way you respond to them, and the way you choose to interact." For the first time, Officer Harris seemed to understand. His face, which had once held an air of superiority, now looked sheepish, as if the truth had been laid bare for him. He glanced at Officer Thompson, who was visibly uncomfortable, his jaw clenched as he processed the weight of the moment. The man let out a breath. "You've learned something today. But now, it's up to you to apply it, to remember that I'm not the only person out there who faces this kind of treatment. There are many people just like me, people who get stopped, judged, and humiliated on a daily basis, simply because of who they are. And we have a responsibility to protect them, not make their lives harder." The officers nodded slowly, their expressions somber. They had heard his words, and they knew this wasn't just about a traffic stop. This was about a reckoning, a wake-up call that challenged their core beliefs. And in that moment, the man's power wasn't just in the badge he wore, it was in his ability to speak the truth with dignity and force. "Take this as a lesson," the man added, his voice firm but not unkind. "I'll be reporting this incident, but I want you to know that I'm not looking to get you in trouble. What I want is for you to recognize the harm that has been done and do better in the future." The officers were quiet, their faces now showing signs of internal reflection. The man's message had resonated deep within them, but the journey to change was far from over. They had taken the first step, and now it was up to them to follow through. As the man turned to walk back to his car, the officers stood in place, processing the magnitude of what had just transpired. They had learned something invaluable that day, a lesson they would carry with them for the rest of their careers. And for the man, the new state police chief, this moment was just one small part of a much larger journey, a journey to ensure that his department, and the law enforcement community as a whole, would no longer operate under the weight of unjust assumptions. The man turned to leave, his calm demeanor masking the years of frustration and effort that had led him to this moment. He wasn't interested in seeing the officers grovel or apologize for their actions. What mattered was change, and he knew this encounter, though uncomfortable, had planted a seed that could grow into something transformative. However, Officer Thompson, still shaken, called after him. "Wait, sir. Chief, please." The man paused but didn't turn around. He could feel the weight of the officer's gaze on his back. They were beginning to understand the gravity of their mistake. Officer Thompson's voice was hesitant but genuine. We owe you an apology. A real one, not just the kind of apology we give when we're caught in a lie. I'm sorry for how we treated you. I didn't realize who you were, and it doesn't excuse how we acted. You didn't deserve that." Officer Harris, too, took a step forward, looking the man in the eye for the first time since the revelation. "I'm sorry, Chief. I can't believe we assumed, I can't believe we treated you like that. That wasn't right. I was wrong." The sincerity in their voices was clear, but the man could feel the sting of their actions linger. An apology, while important, could only go so far. They had crossed a line, one that couldn't be easily erased. The man turned to face them, his expression still composed but filled with quiet strength. "Apologies are a start, but they're not enough," he said, his voice low but firm. "You need to understand that what you did wasn't just a mistake. It was a pattern of thinking that has been ingrained in you for far too long. It's a pattern that you must actively unlearn, not just once, but every single day." The officers nodded, their expressions somber. They understood. This wasn't just about one incident. It was about a lifetime of biases they hadn't acknowledged, about the way they had seen and judged people like the man before them. Now that they had been confronted with the truth, they had no choice but to accept the responsibility. "But the real test," the man continued, his voice softer now, "is whether you take this lesson and carry it forward. This moment can't be the end of the conversation. It needs to spark a change in how you approach every person you meet in the future. That's the only way you'll make up for what happened today." Officer Harris, still visibly affected, spoke again. "You're right. This isn't the end. I'll do better. I don't want to be that officer who assumes the worst." "Not anymore." Officer Thompson nodded. "We're committed to making this right, Chief. I promise." The man let out a breath, a small, almost imperceptible nod of approval. It's good to hear that. But remember, this is only the beginning. We all have a lot of work to do. And it's not just about making sure you treat people with respect in the moment. It's about creating a culture in law enforcement where no one is judged unfairly because of the way they look. He paused, making sure his words landed. "It starts with you. And it starts with me, too." The officer stood there, processing the gravity of what he had just said. They had come face to face with their own biases and errors in judgment, but more importantly, they had been shown a path forward. A path that would require them to confront uncomfortable truths and challenge the very systems they had been a part of. The man wasn't just asking them to apologize, he was asking them to evolve. He was asking them to change, not just for his sake, but for everyone they would ever encounter in the future. "Thank you," Officer Harris said softly, almost as if the words were new to him. "For giving us this chance. We won't let you down." The man nodded once more, then turned toward his car, his steps measured and deliberate. He wasn't just walking away from the scene, he was walking toward the future, where moments like this could lead to real, lasting change. As the officers stood in place, watching him leave, they understood that this wasn't just about one man, one encounter, or one mistake. It was about a larger shift in how they viewed the world, and how they would approach their duties moving forward. The encounter had opened their eyes to something they hadn't truly understood before, but now they couldn't ignore it. And so, the new state police chief drove away, leaving behind not just a lesson for the two officers, but the potential for a broader shift in their department, and in their city. The change had begun, and though the road ahead would be challenging, it was a road they were now committed to walking. The day following the encounter with Officers Thompson and Harris, the police chief was already deep in thought. He had reflected on the lesson he had imparted to the officers, and he knew that this moment of reckoning wasn't just about those two officers. It was about the entire police department and its systemic issues. It wasn't enough to reprimand them privately and move on. He needed to address the broader culture within the department, to make sure that the values of respect, fairness, and justice were being actively cultivated across the entire force. That morning, he met with his staff again, this time to discuss a course of action. He had already instructed his office to begin reviewing the protocols for handling traffic stops and interactions with the public. It was clear to him that many officers still didn't fully understand the impact of their biases and assumptions, so the work he needed to do wasn't just about individual cases, it was about reshaping the culture of law enforcement as a whole. At the meeting, the chief made it clear that no one was exempt from scrutiny, himself included. As the head of the department, he understood that he had a responsibility to lead by example. He wasn't just there to oversee policy changes, he was there to guide the officers on their journey toward self-awareness, inclusivity, and equity. But it was important to emphasize that the process of accountability needed to be systemic, not individual. He started by addressing the issues head-on. This isn't about one or two bad apples. It's about a much deeper problem in how law enforcement has been trained and how we've been conditioned to view people. It's time to confront those biases and challenge them, he said, his voice firm. We've all been part of a system that has failed to recognize the humanity of certain groups of people, especially people of color. And that stops now. As he spoke, the room was silent. Some officers avoided eye contact, while others nodded, unsure of how to proceed. But there was an undeniable shift in the room. The chief was speaking not as a boss, but as someone who understood the difficulties of the job, who understood how ingrained these biases could be, and who was determined to change the direction of the department. The chief's decision to take immediate action involved opening up several new initiatives. He established a series of mandatory workshops for all officers. These weren't just the usual sensitivity training that so often fell flat. The chief wanted real, substantive conversations that would push officers to think critically about their actions and assumptions. He brought in experts in the field of racial justice, social inequality, and community relations. They would lead the workshops, offering insights into how law enforcement could more effectively serve a diverse public. But he didn't stop there. He implemented an anonymous feedback system where members of the community could report instances of perceived bias, mistreatment, or misconduct. He understood that transparency was key, and that holding officers accountable wasn't something that could be done behind closed doors. The feedback system allowed the department to collect data on how officers were interacting with the community and helped identify problematic patterns. The most challenging part of his decision was the disciplinary action he had to take. While the chief knew that change could not be forced on anyone, he also understood that there had to be consequences for poor behavior, especially when it came to officers in positions of authority. He decided that Officers Thompson and Harris would both undergo intensive cultural competency and bias training, something they had never been required to do before. In addition to that, they would be assigned to community engagement projects for a period of time. The community had to be shown that law enforcement officers were more than just authority figures, they had to be seen as allies. It was one thing to read about racial profiling in books or attend a seminar, but it was entirely different to engage with the very people affected by it. The police chief didn't shy away from addressing the full scope of their actions. This situation was not just a mistake, he said to his officers in the meeting. It was a failure on your part to recognize the humanity of the person you were interacting with. But now you've been given an opportunity to change. We will not shy away from difficult conversations. And you will have the responsibility to prove to the community, and to yourselves, that you are willing to evolve. As part of their reformation process, Officer Thompson and Officer Harris were required to personally apologize to the man they had pulled over. It was an uncomfortable request, one that both officers initially resisted. But the chief explained the importance of humility and taking responsibility for one's actions. An apology is not just about saying sorry. It's about acknowledging the harm that has been done and showing genuine remorse. You owe him that, the chief said firmly. You need to recognize the effect your actions have on people, on real human beings. The day of the apology, the officers found themselves sitting across from the chief, unsure of how to begin. They had never had to humble themselves in this way before, and the discomfort they felt was palpable. But when they finally spoke with the man, they saw the gravity of their mistake. The man, who was the state police chief, didn't expect them to beg for forgiveness, but his presence was a reminder that their assumptions had been deeply flawed. They had assumed that a man in an expensive car, wearing a sharp suit, was somehow less deserving of respect. That assumption had been the cornerstone of their behavior. I'm sorry for how we treated you, Officer Thompson began, his voice steady but remorseful. I failed to see the person in front of me and instead focused on what I thought I knew about you. I made a judgment based on your appearance, and I was wrong. Officer Harris nodded, his own apology echoing Thompson's words. I can't imagine how it must have felt to be treated that way. It wasn't right. And I will work every day to make sure I never make that mistake again. The chief sat quietly as the officers spoke, watching them carefully. He had been through his own struggles and had witnessed similar moments of reckoning throughout his career. He knew that this wasn't the end of their journey, but rather the beginning of their growth. They had taken the first step, but real change was going to require consistent effort. Once the apology was made, the police chief continued to push for reforms. He opened up channels for dialogue within the department, encouraging officers to share their experiences and reflect on the inherent biases they may have. For many, the conversations were eye-opening. Officers began to recognize how their own upbringing, cultural conditioning, and biases had shaped their actions on the job. This kind of introspection, while uncomfortable, was necessary for real progress. The chief also made it a priority to engage with the community in new and meaningful ways. He believed that to rebuild trust, officers needed to show up not just as enforcers of the law, but as human beings who cared about the people they served. He started initiatives like Coffee with a Cop, a program where officers met with residents in local cafes to have casual, open conversations about their concerns and experiences. He also expanded the community policing program, encouraging officers to form real connections with residents. Despite the many challenges, the department began to slowly change. Complaints of racial profiling started to drop, and the number of positive interactions between officers and citizens increased. It wasn't perfect, and the road was still long, but the progress was undeniable. The officers who had once treated the state police chief as just another suspect now understood that their assumptions had cost them much more than a ticket. It had cost them the opportunity to truly serve the people they had sworn to protect. But not everyone was happy with the changes. There were some officers who resented the new leadership, who believed that the emphasis on cultural competency and community engagement was unnecessary, or that the department had become too soft. Some even resisted the mandatory training, preferring to continue operating the way they always had. However, the chief remained resolute, knowing that true progress could not be stopped by resistance. It would take time, patience, and perseverance, but he believed in the department's potential for change. By the end of the year, the police chief stood before his officers once again, addressing them at a year-end meeting. The department had made strides, but there was still much work to be done. He wasn't satisfied with the progress they'd made, but he was encouraged by it. We've come a long way, he said, but this journey isn't over. We can't stop here. We have to keep challenging ourselves. We have to be relentless in our commitment to justice and fairness, not just on paper, but in every single interaction we have with the people we serve. The chief's words resonated deeply with his officers. The road had been long, and it hadn't been easy. But it had been worth it. The department had taken a hard look at itself and was making the kind of changes that would ultimately lead to better policing and stronger communities. In that moment, the chief knew that the seeds of change had been planted. They were growing, and while the process might take time, the results would be worth every step of the journey. And as he looked around at his officers, he knew that they were all now walking down that road together.